When it comes to dealing with any kind of economic or social changes within society, we have to look at a three-pronged approach. First, you work internationally and try to create solidarity within groups that work to make international efforts. Second, you also work with economic stability or try to make changes in tax reforms. And third, you can also demand domestic changes or things like political changes. And this idea of a three-pronged approach is especially helpful for today's question. What can the African Union do to help the economic and social stability of countries affected by Ebola? We can see the African Union should adopt this three-pronged approach and do three things. First, they need to communicate with China to create new economic deals and re-stabilize the region when it comes to new jobs. Second, they need to reduce mandatory taxation, or the money that's basically the AU is giving, or that these countries are giving to the African Union. But third, they need to fire Mugabe, who is a huge political issue when it comes to actually leading through African Union to help these main countries. But first, they need to communicate with China for trade deals. So what's been happening according to a Wall Street Journal article of October 21st is that China has been a major job creator within the region of things like Sierra Leone and Liberia, and basically has created things like, according to the same article, the China Civil Engineering Corporation, which has basically been building roads and bridges within the region in Sierra Leone. What's happened since the Ebola outbreak is that these kind of corporations with Chinese immigrants who have actually receded outside and back to China because of the Ebola scare. So what the African Union needs to do is to work with these firms and work with China to create trade deals in which that fundamentally get these individuals back into the region and creating these jobs again. According to the same article, about 1/2 of the Chinese population that lived in Sierra Leone has went back to China because of the Ebola scare. So what needs to fundamentally happen by the African Union is to give protection to these Chinese immigrants to come back and start building jobs once more. These kind of engineering firms need to help build these roads and bridges that have fundamentally left the region. And the African Union has every reason and capability to actually kind of make these kind of endeavors. It goes back to their main constitution, which mandates that they have this kind of economic and outreach with international groups, mainly with the South Pacific and China. But secondly, we can see that the African Union fundamentally needs to reduce the taxation that these countries are actually giving to the African Union. According to the Guardian article of February 4th, the African Union is primarily using its fund to fight two things. One, the Darfur conflict, and secondly, the AIDS crisis, none of which have anything to do with Ebola and how it's affecting the countries of Sierra Leone and Liberia. So what's happening is these countries, mainly the countries that are affected by Ebola, are giving money to the African Union. And what the African Union is doing with that money is spending on things like the AIDS crisis and dealing with Boko Haram and dealing with other major crises. What it's not actually doing is giving money back to these countries to help deal with the Ebola crisis. What's happening is the organizations with the most efficacy are things like the World Health Organization, which have actually invested within these regions to give back and fight Ebola. So taxing these countries is basically unfairly hurting them when it comes to dealing with the Ebola crisis, because we're not seeing these countries actually benefit from these kind of taxations that the AU is lobbying against them. So releasing them from these tax codes, at least temporarily, when it comes to the Ebola crisis, is going to help give the money back to them and fundamentally help them fight the Ebola crisis in new, meaningful ways. So we're going to see them basically have temporary relief money to build new hospitals and new infrastructure. It's going to help them deal with the Ebola crisis from the beginning. But the third and final thing that they need to do, that the African Union needs to do to create any sense of stability, is to fire Mugabe. Now, Mugabe, according to a Washington Wire article of February 2nd, was elected around his 91st birthday and is currently the president of Zimbabwe. Now, the problem with Mugabe is that he is essentially a bad politician. He has, according to a Reuters article of February 21st, has sanctions against him by the EU and the United States. These kind of sanctions are as a result of him having massive human rights violations and also rigging elections in his favor. We've seen him do things like stuffing the ballot box when it comes to him getting elected in Zimbabwe, which fundamentally shows the kind of character he is in power. He's rather ruthless when it comes to taking out other politicians, but also human rights violations. He's been fundamentally problematic when it comes to leading Zimbabwe in the future. And furthermore, he's been bad economically for Zimbabwe's future. We've seen him do things like violate the International Monetary Fund's spending practices to the point where they'll no longer give him any money, and lead Zimbabwe down a very treacherous economic path. We've seen him institute things like austerity laws, which have fundamentally led Zimbabwe down the wrong path economically. And firing Mugabe is going to fundamentally help those dealing with the Ebola crisis, because he's going to have more efficacy with things like the World Bank and the IMF, who can lend them new monies to actually deal with and build the infrastructure to deal with the Ebola crisis. So we have to fire Mugabe first and foremost, so the African Union has the efficacy it deserves and needs to actually tackle the Ebola crisis in the first place. And as long as Mugabe is in presidency and a chairperson for the AU, there's no chance for these countries to kind of have these new relief efforts and to have any kind of credibility on the international stage that they need to fight the Ebola crisis. So when we return to today's question, what can the African Union do to help the economic and social stability of countries affected by Ebola? We've seen that there's a three-pronged approach that they fundamentally need to adopt in order to effectively deal with the crisis. First, they need to communicate with China for new trade deals. China's been one of the largest economic and social factors of stability within the region. They've built things like roads and bridges and are helping develop new jobs that they've never seen in the past. And making these new trade deals with China is going to help get those jobs back into the region in Sierra Leone and Liberia and help them build the infrastructure they need and get new jobs to have an economic recovery that they've been suffering from quite some time. But secondly, they need to work with mandatory contributions. The taxation system, when it comes to the AU in these countries, is disproportionately not helping the countries that are giving them taxes in the first place. We've seen how the African Union is spending money on things like Boko Haram and Darfur and also the AIDS crisis that are not going back to help the countries that are affected by Ebola, and is fundamentally basically taxing them with no reason whatsoever. And third, we've seen how Mugabe is a terrible politician who's going to lead the African Union not down the right road to help the Ebola crisis, but basically is shaking loose any credibility these countries had in the first place. So we've seen that the three-pronged approach is fundamentally the right road for the African Union. They need to first create international solidarity to have any help to shake off Ebola. Next, they need to deal with the money problem and get more tax revenue in their systems. But thirdly, they need to work with the politics and make sure that their leaders have their interests at heart.